From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
George Zimmerman got away with murder, but you can't get away from God. And at the end of the day, he's going to have a lot of questions and answers he has to deal with. The law couldn't prove it, but, you know, the world goes in circles.
Got away with murder? That's the juror who ultimately voted to acquit George Zimmerman for killing Trayvon Martin. But she started deliberations believing he was guilty of second-degree murder. She's the one woman of color on the six-woman jury. We'll get response to the ABC exclusive interview. We'll also go to Florida, where protesters are marching from Jacksonville to Sanford. We'll speak with one of them who visited Marissa Alexander. She's the African-American woman tried by the same prosecutor in the Zimmerman case, who is serving a 20-year sentence for firing warning shots into a wall against her abusive husband. He was not injured. But first to Egypt, where the armies called for mass protests against the Muslim Brotherhood. Authorities have also detained ousted President Mohamed Morsi.
The coalition asserts that the threats made by Sisi, leader of the military coup, is nothing short of a full call on civil war.
We'll go to Cairo for the latest from Democracy Now!'s Sharif Abdel-Quddus. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Egyptian state media is reporting authorities have detained ousted President Mohamed Morsi on new charges. This is the first update on Morsi's status since he was forced from office July 3rd. Morsi will reportedly be detained for 15 days pending investigations into his suspected collaboration with the Palestinian group Hamas for a prison break during the 2011 uprising against the Mubarak regime. The news comes as Egypt is seeing major protests today in support of Army General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The Army's top leader asked supporters this week to demonstrate in support of a military crackdown on what he called violence and potential terrorism. We'll have more from Egypt with Democracy Now!'s Sharif Abdel-Quddus after headlines. The United Nations has increased its count of the death toll in Syria's more than two-year-old civil war to cover over 100,000. The figure's up from 93,000 deaths announced last month. Speaking before a meeting with Syrian opposition members at the UN, Secretary of State John Kerry said the U.S. remains committed to convening international peace talks in Geneva on ending Syria's conflict.
There is no military solution to Syria. There is only a political solution, and that will require leadership in order to bring people to the table. Yesterday, I had a conversation with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia. We remain committed to the effort to bring the parties to a Geneva II, to implement Geneva I. And we will try our hardest to make that happen as soon as is possible.
Iran's reportedly floated an offer of direct nuclear talks with the United States. The New York Times reports Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki relayed the proposal earlier this month and offered to facilitate any future discussions. The Justice Department's unveiled plans to restore some of the oversight struck down in last month's Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. Speaking to the National Urban League's annual conference in Philadelphia, Attorney General Eric Holder said he'll ask a federal court to require that Texas obtain federal approval for all changes to its voting laws.
This request to bail in the state of Texas and to require it to obtain pre-approval from either the department or a federal court before implementing future voting changes is available under the Voting Rights Act when intentional voting discrimination is found. Based on the evidence of intentional racial discrimination that was presented just last year in the redistricting case of Texas v. Holder, as well as the history of pervasive voting-related discrimination against racial minorities that the Supreme Court itself has recognized, we believe that the state of Texas should be required to go through a pre-clearance process whenever it changes its voting laws and practices.
A federal court last year ruled the Republican-controlled state house in Texas discriminated against people of color in its redrawing of political maps for congressional and legislative districts ahead of the 2012 election. Holder's announcement marks the Obama administration's first policy move since the Supreme Court invalidated a critical portion of the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act that required 9 states with a history of racial discrimination to obtain federal approval for changes to voting rules. Holder says more actions will be announced in the coming weeks, including challenges to voter ID laws nationwide. The lone woman of color on the all-female jury that acquitted George Zimmerman has come forward to reveal she believed he was guilty. Speaking to ABC News, the woman, identified by her first name of Maddy, said she initially wanted to convict Zimmerman, but changed her mind after deciding there wasn't enough evidence in the eyes of the law. The juror said she suffers from the outcome of the trial and shares the grief of Trayvon Martin's mother.
It's hard for me to sleep. It's hard for me to eat. Yes.
You haven't asked for money. You haven't asked for a book deal. You haven't asked for anything other than a forum to be able to tell your story.
Yeah. I don't need money. No money in this world could pay me to forget the pain that I'm going through. Trayvon Martin will always be in my heart.
But she wanted to talk about the verdict, how the jury reached it, and about what she sees as perhaps a higher justice.
At the end of the day, he's going to have a lot of questions and answers he has to deal with. The law couldn't prove it. We just have to believe in the Lord that if he has to pay, he will pay.
Maddy says putting her emotions aside and only considering the law was not easy.
I stand by the decision because of the law. If I stand by the decision because of my heart, he would have been guilty.
That exclusive report from ABC, Robin Roberts. Closing statements are underway in the military trial of Army Private Bradley Manning for the disclosure of government information to WikiLeaks. On Thursday, the lead military prosecutor accused Manning of betraying the nation, saying, quote, Manning had the general evil intent. He was not a whistleblower. He was a traitor. Manning's the first ever defendant to face an aiding the enemy charge for leaking government documents to a news source, which could set a major precedent for future cases involving journalists. Defense attorneys are set to make their closing remarks today. The Senate Appropriations Committee has voted to sanction any country that aids NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. The 30-member panel passed the measure by unanimous consent. It calls on the State Department to work with Congress to level sanctions against any government that helps Snowden evade U.S. extradition. Snowden remains holed up at an airport in Russia, where he's reportedly been granted asylum. The oil giant Halliburton has agreed to plead guilty to destroying evidence following the 2010 oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Under the plea deal, Halliburton will pay the maximum fine and remain on probation for 3 years. Federal prosecutors have unveiled charges against the hedge fund giant SAC Capital Advisors for alleged securities and wire fraud. The indictment accuses SAC of enabling a massive insider trading scheme that reaped hundreds of millions of dollars in profit for the firm and its billionaire owner, Stephen Cohen, over more than a decade. Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, said SAC's scheme is unprecedented in size for a U.S. hedge fund.
When so many people from a single hedge fund have engaged in insider trading, it is not a coincidence. It is instead the predictable product of substantial and pervasive institutional failure. As alleged, SAC trafficked in inside information on a scale without any known precedent in the history of hedge funds. As described in the indictment, the scope of illegal trading was deep and it was wide. It spanned more than a decade in time, involved the securities of at least 20 public companies, extended across multiple sectors of the economy, and benefited SAC to the tune of at least hundreds of millions of dollars.
The charges against SAC mark a rare departure for federal prosecutors in that they chose to avoid a deferred prosecution agreement that allows a firm to avoid indictment if they agree to change their behavior. The banking giant UBS has agreed to pay an $885 million settlement for deceptively selling mortgage-backed securities to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Under the terms of the deal, UBS does not admit to any liability or wrongdoing, and its executives will avoid charges. UBS is among 18 banks pursued by the Federal Housing Finance Agency for dumping the toxic securities that helped cause the nation's financial crisis. UBS previously paid a $1.5 billion fine for its role in the manipulation of LIBOR, the basis for rates on trillions of dollars in transactions across the globe. A federal judge has cleared a lawsuit accusing the Wall Street giant Morgan Stanley of encouraging the targeting of African-American homeowners in Detroit. The plaintiffs in the case include 5 black Detroit residents who say Morgan Stanley helped subprime mortgage lender New Century Mortgage Company issue loans likely to push borrowers into foreclosure. In his ruling, U.S. District Judge Harold Baer tied Detroit's current bankruptcy woes to the actions of major banks, writing, quote, "It is not difficult to conclude that Detroit's current predicament, at least in part, is an outgrowth of the predatory lending at issue here." The North Carolina Senate has passed sweeping restrictions on abortion contained in a motorcycle safety bill. The measures spark mass protests from opponents who say they threaten to shutter clinics. North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory has said he'll sign the bill despite a campaign promise not to approve new restrictions on abortion. A federal judge, meanwhile, has delayed until next year the enforcement of Alabama's new anti-choice law, which threatens to close more than half the state's abortion clinics. The measure forces doctors at the state's 5 clinics to obtain admitting privileges at a local hospital, a step that can be impossible in part because some hospitals oppose abortion. The news comes as abortion rights supporters have launched a nationwide caravan aimed at mobilizing supporters of reproductive freedom. Participants in the Abortion Rights Freedom Ride plan to travel in the coming weeks to Wichita, Kansas, Jackson, Mississippi, and other areas where access to abortion is under attack. Organizer Sansara Taylor spoke at a kickoff rally in New York's Union Square.
We're going to all the states with only 1 clinic left. We're going to North Dakota, where on August 1st they plan to shut down, they have a law that would shut down the only clinic left in North Dakota. We're hoping for an injunction, we're expecting an injunction, but we're going to be there either way because the fact that these laws pass is totally unacceptable. There needs to be a massive fight in this country of people standing up and refusing to tolerate this because women's lives and women's future and ultimately the kind of society we want to live in is at stake.
An Ohio gay couple dealing with a life-threatening illness has won recognition of their marriage after marrying out of state. John Arthur, who's dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, and his husband, James Obergefell, tied the knot in Maryland earlier this month in order to ensure they were legally wed before the end of Arthur's life. A federal judge has ruled Arthur's death certificate must show Obergefell as his surviving spouse, ensuring that the two can be buried next to each other on Arthur's family plot. The ruling could prompt other Ohio same-sex couples married out of state to seek recognition of their unions. Alabama has carried out its first execution in 2 years. Andrew Reed Lackey was killed by lethal injection Thursday night for the 2005 stabbing murder of 80-year-old Charlie Newman. Lackey was put to death despite claims he suffered mental illness. Thousands of people rallied in Tunisia Thursday after a leading opposition figure was shot dead. Mohamed Brahmi, a leftist member of the Tunisian parliament, was killed outside his home. Tunisian unions have called a general strike to protest his murder. A landmark report on Colombia's more than 50-year internal conflict has found nearly 250,000 people have been killed, most of them civilian. The report tackles the military conflict between the Colombian armed forces and leftist guerrillas dating back to 1958, as well as the right-wing paramilitaries that have emerged since the 1980s. Gonzalo Sanchez, head of the Colombian investigative team, unveiled the findings.
Del conjunto de muertes violentas ocurridas en el país.
The total of violent deaths in the country between 1958 and 2012 is at least 220,000, caused by the armed conflict. 80% of these have been unarmed civilians.
Es una guerra que ha enlutado.
It's a war that has left most of the country mourning, but very unevenly. It's a war whose victims are in the vast majority non-combatant civilians. It's a depraved war that has broken all humanitarian rules beyond social and political objectives that multiple gangs could brandish.
According to the report, Colombia's bloodiest period came between 1985 and 2002, when wealthy elites formed paramilitaries to battle rebels and attack civilians. The main paramilitary group, the AUC, was responsible for the bulk of nearly 2,000 massacres since 1980, as well as the worst atrocities. The guerrilla group FARC was responsible for the most kidnappings and attacks on infrastructure. An estimated 4.7 million people have been displaced since 1996, and around 1,200 indigenous Indians have been killed over the same period. The paramilitaries have long worked closely with the successive right-wing Colombian governments, who in turn have received billions in U.S. aid. The report was commissioned in 2011 as part of ongoing peace talks with the rebel group FARC. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Egypt, where state media is reporting authorities have issued an official order to detain ousted President Mohamed Morsi. This is the first update on Morsi's status, who's been held incommunicado since he was forced from office July 3rd. The arrest warrant calls for Morsi to be detained for 15 days pending investigations into his suspected collaboration with the Palestinian group Hamas to escape from prison during the 2011 uprising. He's also accused of working with Hamas to attack police stations, killing and abducting police officers and prisoners during the uprising, and espionage. Senior Brotherhood leader Issam El Arian responded by condemning the arrest warrant.
The announcement that Morsi has been detained for 15 days today, the morning of this merciful day, the Friday of discernment, on which millions of Egyptians are gathering to demand the return of the legal president, the return of legitimacy, the constitution, and the elected parliament, is proof of the confusion that prevails amongst those who carried out the coup, and it is also proof of the collapse of agreement that we live in a state of laws.
Meanwhile, Hamas spokesperson Sami Abu Zuhri responded to the allegations against Morsi in a statement to the outlet Middle East Online, saying, quote, "This is a dangerous development, which confirms that the current powers in Egypt are giving up on national causes and even using these issues to deal with other parties, first among them the Palestinian cause," he said. The news comes as Egypt braces for major protests today in support of Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The Army's top general has called for people to demonstrate in support of a military crackdown on what he called violence and potential terrorism. We can go now directly to Cairo, where we're joined by Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Qaddous. Sharif, can you respond to these latest developments? First, Morsi being detained. I mean, he has been in detention, is that right?
Right. He's been held incommunicado by the military since July 3rd, when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the head of the armed forces, deposed him and overthrew him following that massive uprising on June 30th. There haven't been any charges leveled against him. And then this morning, which is, it's a Friday morning, it's a vacation, it's a weekend, and the judiciary typically does not work on the weekends. We have this order coming down from a judge leveling the first kinds of any formal legal measure against him. And those were detention pending investigations into these accusations. Now, these accusations are very telling that they include, suspected collaboration with the Palestinian group Hamas to break out of prison. We have to remember that Morsi himself and other top Muslim Brotherhood leaders, as well as a number of activists, were rounded up in the first days of the January 25th uprising in 2011 and were held as political prisoners. And so the fact that, breaking out of prison during what was essentially a political detention is a charge, I think is very telling. And it also accuses him of conspiring with Hamas to attack police stations, to attack soldiers. We have to remember that, in the opening days of the January 2011 uprising, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians were in the streets, and many groups, and they included the Muslim Brotherhood on January 28th. They were a minority, but many police stations were attacked. 99 or 100 were burnt down across the country. And this was by many Egyptians who saw the police force as a lawless militia that was engaged in torture and so forth. I mean, the revolution itself began on January 25th, which was National Police Day, and they did that for a reason, to oppose the police. So these charges that, accuse Morsi of collaborating with Hamas to attack police, I think is also a way of trying to whitewash the former regime's crimes and whitewash police crimes during the Mubarak era, but also during the revolution.
And the response of the progressive forces that were in the streets to oust Morsi just a few weeks ago to what is happening now, and then to this bringing in the issue of Israel and Palestine here.
Well, as you mentioned, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the head of the armed forces, and who's de facto running the country right now, went on television a few days ago and dressed in full military regalia and wearing dark sunglasses, really looking like kind of an army general of a banana republic from Latin America in the 1980s, and then saying, calling on Egyptians to go and fill the streets of Egypt today, to give him what he called a mandate to confront what he said was potential violence and terrorism, and a clear indication against Morsi's supporters who have continued a month-long sit-in, or nearly a month, in different parts of Cairo, and who have taken to marching across the city, across Cairo and different cities across the country, at times provoking clashes. Both sides have been armed. Nearly 200 people have died over the past month. The worst case was the army shooting at Morsi supporters outside the Republican Guard headquarters that killed over 50 people. But so we have these two kind of very polarized sides coming to the streets now in a very tense and violent time. So we have members who support the military's overthrow of Morsi, and that includes the National Salvation Front, that loose coalition of opposition groups. Mohammed al-Baradei himself, who's in the interim government, has not really spoken out against this. Tamarrud, the youth group that gathered petitions that really were the first to call for the June 30th protests, have also backed this. But there also have been Morsi critics who have opposed the defense minister's call today. Groups like the April 6th Youth Movement and other leading activists who are staying home and reject what they see as a very dangerous pretext for the military to come in and perhaps use widespread, a very harsh crackdown on the Brotherhood. Many see this as possibly a pretext, especially given that Morsi was charged, to clear these large sit-ins that Morsi supporters have had in different parts of the country. We see military APCs now that are deployed around Tahrir Square, and a lot of police trucks as well. Some of them are handing out posters of the head of the armed forces, Sisi. And we've also seen the media, the private media, which has been really towing the army line and really bolstering the army narrative, has decided, many of the channels, to cancel their entertainment series tonight. It's Ramadan, and after people break their fast, there's usually these very highly produced and highly watched drama TV series and different TV shows, and they've canceled all of those today to entice people to go out, to cover the rallies. So it's this kind of atmosphere that we're in, and there's I think a widespread fear of more violence with this many people on the streets, and the minister making these kind of provocative calls. Apparently, the Obama administration has determined now that it's not legally required to even determine whether a coup took place. An official was quoted in the New York Times today saying that the law does not require us to make a formal determination. So they are, skipping past the issue because, as you heard Congressman Rand Paul say, which is correct, that if the U.S. determines this to be a coup, then it automatically, by law, forces them to stop providing the more than $1.3 billion in annual aid that it's given. The Obama administration, in its first move and its first sign of any kind of displeasure with what is happening, has ordered the halt of these 4 F-16s. In the broader scheme of things, this seems like a very calibrated position that keeps the aid going, but shows a sign of discomfort. But I think we have to make an important note here is that Egypt, the military does get this $1.3 billion of aid, but it has to be spent purchasing U.S. weapons. And so all of this money really gets funneled to U.S. defense contractors that are the real big beneficiary of these funds, that have very large lobbying firms in Washington and that lobby very strongly for this aid to keep going. And Egypt has more tanks than Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa combined. We just keep buying this equipment and it's sitting in warehouses. And we also have to understand that the Washington Post had a very interesting article today showing that since the 1980s, the United States has granted Egypt an extraordinary ability to make these orders with these American defense contractors that are worth far more than the funds Congress has already appropriated. So it's essentially like this massive credit card that Egypt has with a limit of billions of dollars. And it's something called cash flow financing. So Egypt can submit these large orders for equipment that will take years to produce and deliver. And it's under the assumption that U.S. lawmakers will just continue funneling the aid. And so when you had lawmakers like Patrick Leahy, the senator from Vermont, trying to reassess U.S. aid to Egypt, they were stunned to learn how difficult it is to actually shut off this pipeline. So I think there's a deep level of intricacy with these U.S. defense contractors and the way the aid is structured that keeps this aid flowing to Egypt regardless of what's happening on the ground.
What would you like to say to Trayvon's parents?
I would like to apologize because I feel like I let them down. I didn't know how much importance I was into this case because I never looked at color, and I still don't look at color.
ABC's Robin Roberts asked Maddy about the jury considering a manslaughter charge against Zimmerman at one point in their deliberations.
When you all sent that note to the judge asking for an explanation on manslaughter, what was that about?
What we were trying to figure out was manslaughter. In order to be charged, we had to prove that when he left home, he said, "I'm gonna go kill Trayvon Martin."
And now we go to another comment of Maddy.
I was the juror that was gonna give him the hung jury. Oh, I was. I fought to the end.
Do you have regrets that you didn't?
Kind of. I mean, I'm the only minority, and I felt like I let a lot of people down.
I mean, this is quite remarkable what she has said. As you said, started the six-woman jury, non-black jury. Three of them were for some kind of conviction, 2 manslaughter, and Maddy for second-degree murder when they first were polled, when they first started deliberations, and 3 were for acquittal. What is this understanding she has of the law? And also, what does manslaughter mean?
Well, let's start with this. Manslaughter is generally considered an unlawful killing, and there has to be an intentional act, okay? So, as you recall, murder in the second degree had that element of ill will, depraved mind, evil intent. Get rid of that. So we're just talking about an unlawful killing with an intentional act. In this case, which is so confounding about her statement, because she makes a point about mentioning the word intent. In this case, no one is disputing that it was an intentional act. George Zimmerman pulled the trigger. No one said he didn't. No one said he was under any outside influence. So that's not in contention. Yet she is resting at least part of her explanation on that element. So I do think, though, that both sides, the prosecution and defense, did not spend enough time talking about manslaughter in their summations. And this has been a prevalent view, at least in the media.
Well, clearly the prosecutors did not want to go for manslaughter. They didn't originally charge. As they saw the trial going on, they saw they were in a bind. And so isn't that right? They then introduced it.
It is partially correct. Generally, prosecutors charge the highest charge they can possibly make a tangential connection to. And Zimmerman's actions made the connection to that depraved mind element. So they charge murder in the second degree. Now, the other reason that you charge a bit higher is for plea bargaining's sake, that if Zimmerman was amenable to a plea, he could have pled to the manslaughter at that point. And finally, in a trial, you always expect that a lesser included offense is an option. So you have to argue that. And that was a huge deficiency in the prosecution's summations and, frankly, the defense. But I can somewhat understand why the defense didn't do that. They went for the all or nothing at all. Right. But prosecution, you have to. I think this is one thing that I just don't understand. You can't ignore evidence. You can't talk to a jury and pretend, oh, this didn't happen, or like just shut your eyes to certain types of evidence. You have to address everything.
I want to ask you about a few issues in the trial. First of all, the jury. It's a 6-woman, non-black jury.
Right.
You know, we often say the word non-white. The person's non-white. We don't often say non-black, but this is extremely relevant here. How does that happen? Can you explain for a general audience, how do jurors get chosen?
Sure. Okay. Now, generally speaking, in most states, for felonies, it is a 12-person jury. And for misdemeanors, it's a 6-person jury. In Florida, only capital cases, so those involving death penalty, are 12-person juries. This is a huge issue, which is now being thankfully brought up with the legislature, perhaps changing that rule. Because 6-person jury, it's not as representative. You don't have as many voices for both sides, okay? So I guess the trick in selecting a jury is that you pick person by person. So if I have you, and then I have the camera person, and then I have the producer, I am having one by one by one. You don't pick in a group. So after I have 6 people, I look and I say, oh, well, I have 6 white people, or I have 6 women.
But you
can't
see
go
that
back.
at 3, you see that at 4, you see you're getting a non-black jury. You don't have any single African-American.
But you have... Right, but you have challenges, and the other side has challenges. So at this point, it's very hard to gauge. You could set yourself up to have women and men, black and white. Now, another huge issue with Sanford County. Sanford County is, I think it's approximately 70% white. So when they say a jury of your peers, you are starting off with a jury pool that is representative of the county. Okay, so all those people that walked in, you remember there was 2 or 3 days of jury selection, they were mostly white people. But the jury that is chosen is also depending on the questioning. So there was a lot of questions going back and forth about how many people knew about this case, and many people did know about this case, and that's how they ended up with this jury. I will tell you, I have no idea how the prosecutors allowed that woman, Maddy, on this jury.
Because?
Everything she says is just absolutely preposterous. It's hurtful as a lawyer for someone to say, I fought till the end. Well, no, she didn't, because if she fought to the end, we would have had a hung jury. And that is also the prosecution's issue, is that they did not question the jurors enough and let them know that it's a possibility. You don't have to come to a verdict.
She clearly wanted to be on this jury, but let's go to another of the jurors, the first one who spoke out. Earlier this month, CNN's Anderson Cooper did the first interview with another of the 6 women jurors. She was seated in darkness. She was only identified as Juror B29 in the interview. She didn't identify herself like Maddy did. Cooper talked about Trayvon Martin's friend, Rachel Jantal, who appeared as a witness during the trial. She was on the phone with Martin just before he was shot dead. Cooper asked the juror specifically what she thought of Jantal's testimony.
I didn't think it was very credible, but I felt very sorry for her. She didn't ask to be in this place. She didn't ask. She wanted to go. She wanted to leave. She didn't want to be any part of this jury. I think she felt inadequate toward everyone because of her education and her communication skills. I just felt sadness for her.
You felt like, what, she was in over her head?
Well, not over her head. She just didn't want to be there. And she was embarrassed by being there because of her education and her communication skills, that she just wasn't a good witness.
Did you find it hard at times to understand what she was saying?
A lot of the times. Because a lot of the times she was using phrases I have never heard before and what they meant.
So that term creepy-ass cracker that Rachel Gentile said Trayvon had used, and that you're saying that's simply how Trayvon and Rachel talk to each other?
Sure. That's the way they talk.
And did you see that as a negative statement or a racial statement, as the defense suggested?
I don't think it's really racial. I think it's just everyday life. The type of life that they live and how they're living in the environment that they're living in.
So you didn't find her credible as a witness?
No.
That was Anderson Cooper interviewing this juror, the first juror who spoke out. She went in, she said, to the deliberation, saying that he was he should be acquitted, and she obviously stuck with that.
And what she did, B37, was clearly amplify the disconnect between the cultures in Sanford County. How dare she say that Rachel Gentile is embarrassed or felt inadequate? That just,
When you say how dare she, she's just a person on a jury, and these how jurors think, right? I mean, we're seeing this sort of a spectrum here.
I think that race was brought up before, and when Rachel Gentile walked into the room, it really hit it home for people that perhaps there was this disparity between the jurors and Trayvon Martin. However, why would we think so little of people in our community because you're white, that you can't connect with someone from a different race or from a different culture? And that was my starting point until I saw that interview and heard what she had to say. She found Rachel Gentile to be incredible just because of who she was, which was authentic. She was honest. She owned up to her inconsistencies, which frankly were not material to the relevant issues in this case.
The juror who could have hung it, who came in with originally thinking he should be guilty of second-degree murder. Explain how a jury works, how a jury gets swayed. Did she understand she could hang this jury?
Well, that's exactly the point, is that I think she did not. I would like to believe that during the instructions she was listening, that the jury had to come to a unanimous verdict and that there were these other options. But frankly, from her interview, she sounds like she didn't know, because she's saying she fought hard for a conclusion, and that was her conclusion, a not guilty verdict.
What do you think the prosecution did wrong?
The prosecution, and I actually wrote an article about this, but the prosecution, where they went wrong was here. They should not have introduced the statements by George Zimmerman. There was a video reenactment, there was the interrogation tape in the police station, and there was the Hannity interview. Now, let me explain this. In most of this country, prosecutors do not enter on their case in chief statements where a defendant says, I'm not guilty. Those are exculpatory statements. Anytime you get a statement like that, prosecutors say, I'm not putting this in, because this helps their case.
Also, they're not hearing George Zimmerman. They don't get, because he's not going to testify, but they get to meet George Zimmerman in this video.
Right. But, okay, so just legally, let me just explain. Defense cannot put in statements by our clients when our clients say they're not guilty. So this is how it could have played out. The prosecution should not have put those statements in. The defense could not put those statements in. The prosecution would have then forced George Zimmerman's hand to testify if he wanted the self-defense instruction. You don't get a self-defense instruction unless there's a foundation in the evidence at trial. So either George Zimmerman wouldn't have testified and wouldn't have had a defense, or he would have testified and ultimately would have made at least 1 or 2 or 10 inconsistent statements with his 3 prior interviews, because, Amy, you can't have 4 stories in one. And then the prosecution would have had the opportunity to play those statements and confront him with it and impeach him on those inconsistencies. So I've never, ever seen, I've been doing this for almost 20 years, I've never seen a prosecutor put a statement by the defendant into evidence where a defendant says, I am not guilty. There is a subliminal subtext going on where the prosecution supports their evidence.
Now, this is very significant because B37, the first juror, the one who was interviewed by Anderson Cooper in shadow, she said the most convincing piece of evidence was seeing the videotape of George Zimmerman do the walkthrough explaining why he did what he did. This was introduced not by the defense, it was introduced by the prosecution.
Right, and again, defense cannot introduce that. The defense was not ever.
Right.
This is a universal,
of course they would have
in
liked
our country rule. Every day I want to do this, of course, but that is the rule. The defense cannot introduce exculpatory statements.
When Anderson Cooper said to her, but what about the inconsistencies? That's why the prosecutors put in these different videotapes. She said, well, everyone is fallible. Everyone says sort of kind of different things. But there they met him as a human being, and they did not know Trayvon Martin.
His inconsistencies were so minute compared to the big picture. He stayed on message. Every statement, he stayed on message.
In the video.
In all of the statements that he gave, the Hannity interview, the reenactment, the police interrogation, the message was Trayvon Martin was the aggressor. And why is that important? That goes to self-defense. The message always was consistently that he was doing his job in his capacity as a night watchman. He stayed on message. So yes, as a prosecutor, you are corroborating your evidence. And that is what the message that you were sending to the jury.
We have to break, but I'd like to ask you to stay with us, Seema, because we're going to look at the case of Marissa Alexander in Florida. We're going to Florida to speak with a protester who's walking with a group of people from Jacksonville to Sanford, but she has met with Marissa Alexander a number of times and written to her in jail. She is a woman who was sentenced to 20 years in prison by the same prosecutor. She was prosecuted, rather, by the same prosecutors as Zimmerman. She did not get to stand her ground. She fired into a wall to warn her abusive husband to get away, who had abused her and the other women in his life. She did not hurt him, but she was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which she is serving now. Stay with us.
What's also here with a warning? Right now our nation's in mourning. We hope that justice prevails soon. The Martin family, we're with you. We come together, we must care. The negative can go elsewhere. I put my hoodie on while weeping, because this case is so misleading. Right now our nation in mourning. We want justice, and you want it, don't you? We can feel it, cause we've been waiting for it since it happened. I've been over a month. I told you telling the story, and please don't even try to ignore me. This situation is racist. You black and in a hoodie, we suspicious people showing no love. Trayvon, we are your family. We come together, ruling with your mommy and daddy. This situation is crazy, and still we waiting patient for this case to see they trying to ignore us. The police, they were sloppy. They approaching us blindly. Zimmerman is so crazy. He knew it wasn't right, like him until I...
Warning, Watoto from the Nile. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to the growing protests around another Florida shooting case, which had a different outcome from the case of George Zimmerman. It's Marissa Alexander, 31 years old, African-American mother of 3, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison for firing what she maintains was a warning shot at her abusive husband. Alexander had turned down a plea bargain that would have seen her jailed for 3 years. She insisted she'd been defending herself when she fired a shot into a wall near her husband, and as she attempted to use Florida's Stand Your Ground law in her defense. But in March 2012, the jury convicted her after only 12 minutes of deliberation. She was sentenced to 20 years behind bars under a Florida law known as 1020 life that carries a mandatory minimum for certain gun crimes regardless of the circumstance. The case against her was argued by Angela Corey. the same prosecutor in charge of the case against George Zimmerman. Well, to protest her imprisonment as well as the acquittal of George Zimmerman, a coalition of Southern community organizations has been marching in a, quote, walk for dignity. They began Monday in Jacksonville, Florida, where Alexander was convicted, and have been walking since then to Sanford, Florida, where Trayvon Martin was killed. We're joined now by one of the march coordinators, Alita Alston-Ture, founder of the New Jim Crow movement in Jacksonville, Florida. She's been organizing on behalf of Marissa Alexander. She visited her in jail, has written to her extensively. She's joining us by Democracy Now! Video stream from Dickerson Community Center in Daytona Beach, Florida, where the march is now. It's great to have you with us. Explain this case, why it means so much to you, the case of Marissa Alexander, Alita.
Well, the case means so much to me because this is truly, Zimmerman got away with murder. And we're trying to say for the walk for dignity that the shift now is from a legal crisis to a human crisis. And that's because the decades of the prison crisis is now out of hand. It's totally out of hand. We looked in the past at those that said, I am a man, and now we're saying, I am human. We are trying to right now just make a statement that we're taking action. We're taking action by walking together as organizations, as youth, to do something together to change those things. And the two demands that we have is the resignation of Angela Corey, clearly because she is profiting. Her career is to lock people up. She is a politician. And we clearly are saying also that we want to have the release of Marissa Alexander. And enough is enough.
Alita, the quotes are astounding. Angela Corey complained to the Washington Post of the online agitation like yours to free Marissa Alexander, saying, I think social media is going to be the destruction of this country. So let me read from the Daily Beast, which says, no, it's not Alexander's abusive husband, Rico Gray, who said in his deposition, I got 5 baby mamas and I hit every last one of them except for one. That makes Corey see red. What really fries her bacon, this is the Daily Beast, is the idea that anyone questions her overzealous prosecution of a battered woman acting in self-defense. Could you respond to this, Seema Iyer? You're an attorney.
I could respond all day long to Angela Corey, and I'm sure that Alita and both you remember Angela Corey's statements after the Zimmerman verdict. It was tantamount to accepting an Oscar award, and she was thanking her casting crew.
And when I was watching, I was so
glib.
confused. I said, isn't this the woman that brought the second-degree murder charge against George Zimmerman? She sounded like she was part of the defense team.
And that she just lost. That she just lost a case, and she was just enamored with her team, and that's all she focused on, as opposed to the victim and the victim's family. And what Alita is saying is a very interesting concept, the concept of the prosecutor being a politician, or what under the law says the prosecutor's duty is, and that is to be a minister of justice. And there are many prosecutors across this country who do ride that line, and that is some cases need to be prosecuted, some people do need to be locked up, and some cases need to be dismissed.
Now but she gets 20 years in prison. She was estranged from her husband, Rico Gray, and had a restraining order against him, even though they'd had a baby together just 9 days before. Alita, we only have a minute. What more would you want to say as you are on this march from Jacksonville to Sanford? Is there any word on appeal that this case will be thrown out? That she will be freed?
Well, we're closing the gaps. We want to close the gaps of those that cause victims to be, lost in the system. And to do that, we really got to look at the criminalization of women. Beth Ritchie wrote a book called Arrested Justice. And right now we know that we're going to get the anti-domestic violence and the sexual violence groups to know what it is, the impact of stand your ground legislation means when we say I am human. And we do know that this will happen have to have justice, and we will be able to see Marissa, because this is out of control, again, because of the decades of the prison crisis and because of this thing called slavery by another name. It's intentional disregard of the law. It's deliberate indifference.
Alida, I want to thank you for being with us. Alida Alston-Turay, founder of the New Jim Crow movement in Jacksonville, Florida, has met with Marissa Alexander in jail, writes to her. They are ending up, the group of protesters, in Sanford tomorrow for a Trayvon memorial. Seema Iyer, thanks so much for being with us as well. That does it for the show. A very special thank you to Julie Crosby. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Felser, Amati Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Malkoff, Hani Masood, Rabi Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.